Hi, Dirk. Thank you for accepting my invitation for the Skype interview on Interfaith Dialogue.
My pleasure.
Would you first please introduce yourself?
My name is Dirk Ficca. I'm an ordained Presbyterian Christian minister. I've served as a parish pastor in a church in Benton Harbor, Michigan. For 20 years, I worked with the Parliament of the World's Religions, which took me around the world, meeting with everyone from the grassroots up the chain in all the world's religions. And over the last 4 or 5 years, I'm now engaged in a number of projects dealing with interreligious and social cohesion work.
Great. So it shows that our listeners will get a lot of information from a very experienced person who has been on the ground for many, many years. So, would you please introduce or define interfaith dialogue? What does interfaith dialogue mean to you?
Well, I think about the diversity of the world's religions and the ability to speak meaningfully with each other from diverse traditions and perspectives.
Great. So, who are the target audience for interfaith dialogue for Muslims?
Well, I think there should be a dialogue at all levels.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly should be dialogue between recognized leadership in religious communities, should be dialogue between what you might call the religious practitioners who serve communities,
Mm-hmm.
scholars who study the traditions, but I have a personal bias that interreligious dialogue should most importantly be at the grassroots level between everyday people.
Great. What do you think about the challenges of interfaith dialogue in United States, especially?
Well, the United States is a very diverse country, especially over the last 40 years, 50 years, since 1965, when President Johnson signed a very liberal immigration bill that allowed for immigration not only from Europe, but now from Asia, Africa, and South America.
Mm-hmm.
And now the United States is as diverse and representative of all the world's religions as any other country, particularly rooted in cities where diverse religious communities and peoples live side by side. You always have the question of how to deal with diversity. In the United States, for about 150 years, it was predominantly a Protestant Christian country. Then with the Parliament of the World's Religions in 1893, that began to mark the recognition of Catholic and Orthodox Christians and the Jewish community. And with every new recognition of diversity beyond Protestant Christianity, there was tension.
Mm-hmm.
There was misunderstanding. Those who felt like they were the majority struggled with embracing and welcoming minority religions. That, of course, now has accelerated over the last 50 or 60 years when you have, from Anglican to Zoroastrian and everybody in between, when you have the entire range of diversity in the United States. So first of all, with any majority-minority question or with any question of difference, there are challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Aspects of those challenges have to do with, first of all, how comfortable do I feel in my own identity?
Mm-hmm.
My ability to reach out to somebody who's different from me, to see them as they are, to respect them, to live and let live. Um, we often think about that in terms of who the other is. But first of all, it has to do with the challenge for me to feel comfortable in my own tradition, in my own identity, that nothing is at stake for me in getting to know and welcoming somebody of difference. So that's one of the challenges. Uh, Another challenge is how to provide respectful, safe environments for people of difference to get to know each other, to
Mm-hmm.
encounter each other, so that they can see each other accurately. Well, those are a couple of the challenges.
Okay. So, would you like to elaborate more on Trump's administration now? Is there any
Well,
new challenges in this administration?
well, certainly there are. With the recent election
Mm-hmm.
and with the election of President Trump, uh, I do not believe the approach that's being taken um, recognizes and respects difference, be it religious, ethnic, or racial. I believe that um, with President Trump now, people who are feel threatened in their identities, be it religious, cultural, or ethnic. Uh, their anxiety has been heightened, and they're not being encouraged to take a healthy approach in terms of getting to know the new people and arrivals in their midst. It, for me, it's something quite worrisome. Um, uh, Again, I think that we have to deal with this at all levels of our society, with leadership and government, with the various institutions. But ultimately, again, I think the long term solution is at the grassroots level in everyday life, between communities, that people get to know each other there, that they come to respect each other, that their fears about the other are diminished by real relationships. So while the current Trump administration brings a heightened sense of anxiety, uh, potential crisis, and we have to address that,
Mm-hmm.
my long term preference is for a strategy that works at the grassroots. And that ultimately is where, as a society, we will have the most secure future.
Great. Thank you. Do you think it's a kind of necessity to have interfaith dialogue, especially when and where there are many different groups of people of different faiths? And the second part of the question is there are some groups that kind of avoid having interfaith dialogue with you, or some radical groups. So, could you elaborate on these?
There is no alternative to dialogue. If people of diverse peoples, language, culture, religion, ethnicity, are attempting to live with each other, there is no alternative to
Mm-hmm.
dialogue. So, interreligious dialogue uh, is an absolute necessity. 100 years ago, 150 years ago, in most places in the world, you could be a Buddhist in Japan and never run into anybody else but a Buddhist. You could
Mm-hmm.
be a Muslim in Nigeria and never encounter anybody, a Protestant Christian in the United States, and only encountering people who were like you. That is no longer the case.
Mm-hmm.
We are living next door to each other in ways we never have in human history. So the first thing is, to answer your first question, it's an absolute necessity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, to generalize a little bit, I would say that there are basically three groups in society, and or around any kind of dimension of society, political, social, ethnic, religious, there are basically three mindsets. One mindset I would characterize as relatively open, a mindset that does not see difference as a problem to be solved, but something to be embraced.
Mm-hmm.
On the other end of the spectrum, there are those who fear difference, who are not open to dialogue, as you say.
Mm-hmm.
And I think folks who approach it that way should be treated with respect. I think a hand of invitation should always be extended, but I don't think I don't spend a lot of my time with those who are not interested in dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
The most crucial group, in my opinion, the group that will be most crucial in terms of the broader society is the third group that has not made up their mind yet.
Mm-hmm.
They've not decided whether they're going to be open to others who are different or not.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the group that I think, for me, is the most important. How to provide them with opportunities, experiences, relationships, so that they will choose an open path rather than a closed path.
Great, thank you. Should we have any concern about losing our own identity while we are engaging with other communities, with other faith groups?
Well, my experience, 25 years in the interreligious movement, my experience is that interreligious dialogue doesn't threaten my religious identity while broadening my horizons,
Mm-hmm.
acquainting me with new perspectives. It only drives me deeper into my own identity. I worked for the Parliament of the World's Religions for 20 years. We held 4 major parliament events around the world with 8 to 10,000 people each one of them, each one representative of all the world's religions and all the different movements and groups within them. Parliament events would last 8 to 10 days with intense interaction. So let's say roughly 32 people or 32,000 people over those 4 events interacted with each other. I heard not one story of one person converting from one religion to another.
Oh, great, great. Big experience for the last 20 years, you said, or 25 years?
That's right.
20 years.
What I did find, particularly amongst young people, was that they went back and they didn't say, hey, Mom, Dad, I've converted to Buddhism or Hinduism. They came back and said, what does it mean to be a Muslim?
Great.
What does it mean to be a Christian or a Jew or a Sikh? So, it drove them back into their own traditions.
Great. During our interfaith dialogue activities, should we be judgmental to others? We'll see maybe some absurd faiths or applications or some practices in other religions. So at what level should we deal with those kind of behaviors? Just ignore them, or should we discuss or debate about those faith practices?
Well, I've operated by 3 principles over the 25 years I've been engaged in interreligious dialogue. The first principle is harmony, not unity.
Mm-hmm.
So my purpose in interreligious dialogue, in encountering and having relationships with others, is not to become one religiously, not to embrace the totality of each other's religious beliefs and practices.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be who I am. You're going to be who you are. We're going to share that, and in a respectful way.
Mm-hmm.
We may say, well, here I disagree, or I don't share that belief, or I don't share that practice. Secondly, I've operated under the principle of convergence of purpose, not consensus.
Mm-hmm.
So we're never going to get a consensus among the world's religions on belief and practice. In fact, as you know, even within our own traditions, often we don't see eye to eye
Mm-hmm.
and have a consensus on belief and practice. But there are places of convergence.
Mm-hmm.
There are those places where we can talk and work together. So we might disagree on the afterlife or the before life, but different traditions might agree that we should take care of the earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's a
We
place.
have common problems, we have common issues that we can all discuss together around the table, right?
Yes. And the third principle, which is the most important principle for me, is trust is more important than agreement.
Great.
So everything that I do in interreligious dialogue is first to try and establish some kind of trust. And then in a trusting relationship, we can find out where we hold things in common, where we can work together, but more importantly, how to deal with our differences.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much. These are really important principles for interfaith dialogue. So, do you have some other principles that we have to abide with, comply with during interfaith dialogue?
Well,
somebody told me that, for example, it's better not to use we. Rather, we should use I because we may not represent our own belief, kind of.
yeah, well, that in any relationship, we have to be very careful on any matter and in any way. We have to be very careful to distinguish our own point of view from others, not to impose it on them, not to assume. So in any dialogue, I statements rather than you statements or we statements are very important. Another important principle is I'm going to seek to understand you to the best of my ability in the way that you understand yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Such that if I were to give you feedback, here's what I've heard, here's what you believe, here's how you practice. If I would share that with you, you would say, yes, you've described accurately. Okay? Again, just because I understand does not mean I necessarily agree.
Mm-hmm.
But it's crucial that I be open enough so that I understand who you are in the way that you understand yourself.
Great, thank you. What kind of programs, events, activities would you suggest to facilitate, promote interfaith dialogue? I know you have great experience. So conferences, seminars, and what kind of activities?
Again, my bias is that as often as possible, local religious leadership should involve their own communities
Mm-hmm.
in interreligious dialogue, encounter, and activities. I think it's very helpful for each community to first look inward and say, what are our reasons as a Muslim, as a Sikh, as an indigenous person? What are our reasons to engage in interreligious dialogue?
Mm-hmm.
So that when we come to the table, there's no sense that we've compromised who we are, but where in our own tradition does it urge us to do this? I love the principle of hospitality,
Mm-hmm.
or how to welcome others in a hospitable way, and that can be done. Iftar dinners are a wonderful example of that.
Mm-hmm.
Each tradition has its special days or special celebrations to invite others to come to that, and always use hospitality as a way to do that. Sometimes, particularly amongst young people, starting with a project, a common project, uh, doing service of some kind, is a good way to get into it. And then it's important after that to share again the reasons from our own religious identities why service is important. Those are some of the avenues I think that could be pursued.
Hey, thank you. Do you remember once you told us a story about a Muslim, Jew, and Christian got together in a forest, something? Do you remember that?
I don't think that was me. That does not ring a bell.
It was you in our camp, in the winter camp. Uh, you told us a very funny story. Muslim,
Oh,
Jew.
yes, I do remember that.
If you remember it, could you please tell that story?
Yes, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
This is a story I've told all over the world to people of all different walks of life and traditions and identities, and it seems to travel well.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a dark and stormy night, and a Hindu, a Muslim, and a Presbyterian Christian were traveling together.
Mm.
And it got so stormy that they decided they were not going to make their destination. So they stopped at a farmhouse and they asked the farmer if they could spend the night. And the farmer said, yes, of course, but you must know that there are only 2 beds in the guest bedroom. Somebody will have to sleep in the barn.
Mm-hmm.
So the Hindu said, I will go first. It's no problem. I will go sleep in the barn. So the Muslim and Presbyterian are beginning to get ready for bed, and there's a knock at the door, and it's the Hindu. And he says, I was more than willing to spend the night in the barn, but there's a cow in the barn. And you understand, as a Hindu, for religious reasons, I cannot stay in the barn.
Mm-hmm.
So the Muslim says, I completely understand. I will go sleep in the barn. So now the Hindu and the Presbyterian are in their pajamas. They're getting ready to crawl into bed, and there's a knock at the door, and it's the Muslim who says, I was willing to spend the night in the barn, but there's a pig in the barn. And you understand, for religious reasons, I cannot sleep in the barn. And so the Presbyterian says, I understand, and I will not go sleep in the barn. And so now the Hindu and the Muslim are in their pajamas. They've turned off the light. They're crawling into bed. And there's a knock at the door. And it's the cow and the pig.
Thanks so much. It's really funny story. This is the end of my prepared questions. Would you like to add something to educate our young generation for interfaith dialogue?
The 2 positive surprises for me in recent years are Pope Francis and millennials. I didn't see either of those coming. And I admire Pope Francis, the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, for the way, as a Catholic, he reaches out to others. He embraces difference. He's taking the lead in interfaith dialogue. And I also have come to really admire millennials. I have found them to be thoughtful, not just concerned about themselves, but concerned about others. Perhaps because of the diversity of the world, that's the only thing they've ever known. They seem more comfortable with difference in ways that perhaps my generation and generations before me have. And I would say the most crucial thing any young person can do is come to know and make a friend of somebody of another tradition.
Great. Thank you so much for this very enlightening and inspiring talk, and enjoy the rest of the day.
My pleasure.
Thank you.